a lot of the work that we're embarking on in my lab of the Communication Analytics Lab at the University of Queensland involves the study of language and specifically conversation. And we do this in a number of ways. A lot of what we're doing is trying to develop computer science technology for the study of communication, so to help discourse analysts, conversational analysts and others make sense of communication and conversational data themselves. In other ways, we're interested in the development of agents to actually study and interact in conversation itself. So with some of the work I'm going to show you today, it tips on a few different realms in this particular area. No, I'm not. How to vacate a stage, right? I mean, no. It gets detailed, right? And it needs full view. It needs full attention and full view. So as I was saying in that introduction, we know that conversation is more than just information passing. Now I say this, and I'm amongst friends here in saying this, when I give this similar talk to an engineering IT audience, this is a point that has to be made, because there's many that still maintain that conversation is simply just about information transfer. We know that to not be the case. We know that conversation is more than that. It's about power and dominance. It's about ritualistic behavior. It's about rapport. It's about the way that we have and build a relationship, right? So that's important to know, right? And as a starting point in designing any technology that's going to be able to engage in a meaningful conversation, we need that as a starting point. And so it's a really, really important point to be made, is that conversation is more than just information exchange. I want to highlight some work that we're embarking on in our lab. So we're part of the very large centre called the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. And as part of this centre, we're working with linguists and we're working with Indigenous communities in Australia and also in the region. So we have researchers, in fact, some come to Indonesia and into outskirts because of the beautiful diversity of language that we have in our region. We're incredibly fortunate in our region of the world to have an amazing diversity of language. And language gives us a window into the human psyche, into the human experience in a way that is absolutely beautiful and enriching. Some of the work that we're doing in the centre from our aspect of computer scientists coming into language and language research is to build technologies that can actually really assist in the maintenance and the teaching and instruction of these languages. In Australia, it's a great shame that we once had an amazing diversity of Indigenous language. We still have some of those, but we have lost a lot of that Indigenous knowledge. That is our real heritage, and we need to make steps to actually make sure that we can empower the next generation to be able to hold on to what language they still have and to be able to teach that language on to the next generation. And so we see our role in this as using technology to facilitate some of the work that's already ongoing by some very dedicated linguists who work in community, such as what we see here with the Ngurka Language Centre in northern Queensland. And so in this particular image here, you have two amazing Indigenous language workers in Grant and Angelina, and that little robot in the middle is called Opie. And so Opie is designed as it's like a flat pack IKEA style robot, very, very low tech, just a simple tablet in the middle of its torso and a little tablet there with a face. And we've designed this robot over successive generations to be something which is approachable for a younger child and something which can help actually engage children in language play. So the idea here is it's been designed as very, very simple components. This is just a big piece of wood that's got a hole cut in the middle of it. The community itself have decorated this, have started to own it as part of their own community. And this robot actually plays games with students on the use of these languages. to try and reinforce language instruction in classrooms where there might be a limited resource of humans to actually be doing all of the instruction and teaching. So this is an effort to try to embed language and interaction in that kind of community. In our lab, we play with all kinds of robots and devices. This is my older daughter. This is a few years ago now, though she's a bit bigger now, playing with Naomi, one of our Now robots at the time. We think that with language, particularly in conversation, if you're going to build an agent, embodiment is a really important concept here. And so with language, a lot of the technologies we're dealing with at the moment that are having conversations with us lack embodiment. They lack a presence in the world, an ability to interact with and affect their particular space and their world. And this is a really important concept, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. All right. So how do we actually do this? How do we build technologies, and what are the limitations in the technologies we build when we're designing for this kind of post-human communication realm? Well, the field of natural language processing is broken down into a number of key challenges you could consider. So things like sentiment analysis, which is about the affect in communication. How do we reliably tell if someone is angry, is happy, is sad? And how do we do this through perhaps limited communication channels where we're only relying on one modality, perhaps just text? We don't have access perhaps to a face. But what if we did? Could we read just from someone's face? Could we read from the tone of their voice? So it's a very interesting area of research. Co-reference resolution. We do this a lot in language. I just did it then by saying this. The idea of, over there, him, her, it. Right? We use these co-reference identities a lot within our spoken and our written communication, and unless you're part of that context, unless you know what's being referred to, you can be very, very lost. My point here is that conversation is an amazing accomplishment for humans, and we're only beginning to scratch the surface from a computational perspective on how to actually mimic that and be an active part of that conversation. And my point is that we take a lot for granted. Co-reference resolution is one of those things where we're using often, instead of an actual name of a person, we'll say him, her, that. I think you get my point. Boundary detection is another really important point. How to even know the end of someone's turn in a conversation is a really interesting phenomenon, and something that's very, very difficult to know. And so we might instinctively know this, but how do you actually instruct a computer to do this? And so this is a very, very big and incredible challenge for us. Particularly if we're building conversational bots, how do you know when the bot should interrupt? How do you know when the bot should start talking? How do you know when the bot should stop talking? These are unresolved challenges, and it's because we don't really have good, strong rules for in what circumstances we should or shouldn't do this. All right, topic modeling is one of the approaches that we've used a lot within our lab. And what topic modeling is really the idea of taking communication data and figuring out, not just at the word level, but at one kind of level above, the conceptual, the topic-based level, about the gist, the idea of what's being talked about. So the concepts coming out of my talk right now, you might consider things like, post-human, robots, natural language processing. These are the kind of higher order concepts above all of the individual words that I'm speaking. When we try and do this from a computer perspective, there's two major approaches we use. One is a top-down approach, which is a dictionary-based approach. I have a bunch of words, I have a defined meaning for them, and so if I see those words, I'm going to act on them like the dictionary definition. Now, a potential problem with a dictionary definition is, if anyone in this room is on social media will know, that words change their meaning in different contexts. Right? We use words, we reinvent meaning for words all the time. We create entirely new words, right? And so language is a dynamic construct, and it's a phenomenon which is really interesting in how language adapts to circumstance. And so these approaches that are top-down don't necessarily account for all of that variation. these approaches here, these grounded or bottom-up approaches, do. So what they do is they look at word statistics and word frequencies, and they try and build context around how it's being used in the moment. So they would be able to link within, say, an interpersonal communication context, my Uncle Bob really likes fishing. The fact that Bob, in that case, is a person, and that Bob relates to uncle and fishing, whereas Bob as a word might mean to duck or to, do something else like that. And so that context is important, and these approaches can kind of pick that up. All right. One technology that we've pioneered over the last decade is called discursus. I did talk about it when I was here last year, so I won't go right into the nitty-gritty detail again. But essentially, it's used to analyze conversational content, even social media content, and analyze the conceptual content of that and reveal patterns in time. Very, very briefly, the idea of revealing the heartbeat of the conversation. We see discursus similarly to like how a medical professional might see an EEG or some other kind of diagnostic tool. It can reveal the heartbeat of a conversation. And so this is a conversation between a doctor and a patient, taken from one of our early works back in 2012. And what we see here is the doctor in blue, the patient in red. Time is running diagonally down the page, and every one of these squares is a turn in the conversation. So here the patient is talking about having dizzy spells from when they were really young, so they're outlining to the doctor what their concerns are and what they're feeling at that moment. We lay the conversation out down the page, and what you're seeing off diagonal here, all these coloured squares, is they indicate intersection points between different turns where those turns share concepts in common. So what it suggests is that, say for example, that red square there is actually suggesting that whatever turn that one is, that's turn 10, and that's turn about number 6, that they share something in common. There's some concepts there that are shared. So there's concepts of dizziness and such are talked about again. And that's really interesting how we reuse concepts in a conversation, we change topics, these kinds of regular moves that we make in a conversation and how they reveal themselves over a longer period of time. So what we can do is we can analyze this and look for these visual patterns. So we can do this and look for these what we call engagement blocks, where you're getting people talking about the same thing immediately in turn, and we can highlight that and interrogate that further and see what that might be about. We can look at those turns right up there where the patient is repeating themselves and consider that what we call an introductory stripe, where we've got an introduction of some of the concerns that the patient is having, and then those things are being talked about later through that conversation. We can look at the doctor down the bottom here in that big blue square, summarising a lot of things that have happened before because they're referring back to all those points in the conversation. And we can overlay things like the topics that are talked about through the entire conversation. So we can look, they're talking about drinking, they're talking about head injuries, clothing, paints. As it turns out in this context, this person moved to a different state. They're a panel beater, they repair cars, and they were using some paints at home in their workshop at home without proper ventilation. And those things led to them becoming very, very dizzy. This is actually discovered about this point in the conversation. But the point is, this was a controlled study where a bunch of actors were given the same persona when presented to a bunch of different doctors, and then wanted to see if the doctor could elicit these concerns. And so those that engaged in good rapport building, good communicative practice, could actually get to this as being the root of the problem. If we contrast what we know to be a good outcome, one where the diagnosis is known, to one where we have a poorer outcome, we see a very stark difference in the pattern of interaction between the doctors in these cases. In this case here, you might notice that the doctor is doing the majority of the talking. The size of the blue squares give that away. And also the doctor is repeating himself a lot. The patient is absent, and so too is engagement between the patient and the doctor. So this gives us a way to qualitatively assess the communication in a slightly different way than perhaps what is available to us through CA or other kinds of analytic techniques, and is meant to augment that style of analysis, not replace it. That's a very important point. This is not replacing a human, it's giving them another lens through which they can study the conversation. We've applied this into other domains. We've applied this into dementia conversations to look at those. So if anyone here has got experience, they have say a family member or a loved one who's experienced dementia, you will know what I'm talking about here with this kind of neurodegeneration, how it affects communication. And so we see things like repetition, word finding issues, a lot of issues with communication. But we also know communication is very important for people with dementia as a form of kind of mental exercise and input, and something that they can actually feel socially connected to their loved ones. So we want to try and support that. And so a very big project we're embarking on at the moment is exactly in this space. And we did it off the back of some of these results, which showed you don't see a lot of the big kind of what we call the off-diagonal shading. There's not a lot of that repetition of content. But in this case, we do see these little vignettes where there are topics talked about which seem to spark at least something, some kind of interaction with a person with dementia. And so to do this, we've embarked on a fairly bold project, and we're calling it Kelpie, which is an open source speech processing toolkit. The idea here is to take conversations as we know it. To be able to get one of these plots here, we need a full transcribed conversation. We need a transcript where a human has actually done the labour to work out who's speaking when, what they're saying, feed that in. That process, of transcription itself could take a few hours. We put it in the system, a bit longer to actually arrive at this result. We want to speed that process up so we can take, say, source-separated audio, so me being recorded, you being recorded separately, transcribe that automatically, but then also take the pitch information and other kinds of intensity information and use that as part of the analysis as well. Because we know that tone and pitch play a really important role in conversation, so we need to include that in our analysis. So that's exactly what this toolkit aims to do. So I want to show you just a very early result from this. This is hot off the press, unpublished, so please excuse me for the roughness of the finish of it. But this is an early result, and I've got to talk you through it. It's a very busy graph here. So for this one here, what you're actually seeing is an entire 30-minute conversation here between two people, red and blue. And what we're seeing here is that you actually see the turn-taking dynamic between these people. And I'm going to start down here because it's a bit easier to explain because it's nice and big. So this is the person in red talking. That's from minute 7 to 7 minutes 35. And what you see is the person in blue with very, very small interjections. And you know what these are already, don't you? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Right? Back channels, right? And we see back channeling as a really interesting phenomenon. Do you see the back channeling happening by the person in blue? So the red speaker is dominant for this minute and a half of the conversation here, but do you notice how the person in blue continues to, yep, right, all the way through. So we know that that is an important aspect of communication. Right? Now, this is something of an interesting finding. I mean, we know that back channeling has happened. This is not a groundbreaking finding there. We know it's happened. But what we have here is an ability to study this at close detail and to look at the patterns of back channeling that exist interpersonally between two interlocutors like we have here. In different cultural contexts, that kind of interaction happens at a different scale. If we go to one of our Indigenous communities, we might expect that this pattern of turn-taking between these speakers will look very different to the one that I have here, which is between two city dwellers, white folk, that we've recorded at our lab at the University of Queensland, right? And we speak faster. So this system here gives us an ability to encode this in a context-specific way and analyze these turn-taking dynamics, looking at how people exchange turns, how they give up turns, how they wait, how they pause, how long they allow a pause to hang. For those who teach in the room, you'll know this phenomenon when you ask a question to your students and you wait and there's that awkward silence and you have to fight your own instinct to say something because you're waiting for them, how long should you wait? 3 seconds, 5 seconds? So it's that you understand what I mean, right? That pause length. And so pause is a really interesting phenomenon, and we can study it with great accuracy with this new system. All right, so this is where, and I'm finishing up now, where we're kind of planning on using some of this technology. So we're embarking on a fairly big project at the moment called Florence. And so what Florence is going to do, hopefully if we get it right, is to be able to be used in situations between people living with dementia and their care providers. As an assistive technology, the analogy I heard that one of the project leaders, Professor Helen Chenery, she's Dean of Medicine at Bond University back in Queensland at the moment, Helen would talk about the idea that if you break your leg, you get it put in a cast, we rehabilitate you, and you get better, and then you regain full mobility and go back in the community. When someone presents with a conversational impairment, we don't offer a similar prosthetic, right? We don't offer some kind of a treatment or a device to help rehabilitate, to help train, to help work with that person and the difficulty they're having. So Florence as a technology is meant there as a prompt, as an aid, something that's not going to replace the person's voice, but act as a third party to help them through difficult conversational interactions. So I'm going to play out this is a real recording, but it's not actually been implemented yet as I've shown you. So the interjection when it comes is not something that we have achieved yet, but it's where we're kind of looking to go. So we have a person living with dementia here in red and their care provider in yellow. Our system over here is actually listening in using a microphone and listening for what we call a trouble indicating behaviour, a period where the system might accurately detect this person is having some kind of difficulty. They're trying to find a word, they're repeating themselves, there's something that they're doing in the conversation that indicates that some assistance might be required. And so it's listening in at the moment, and it hasn't yet hit a threshold for which you would say that there has been trouble detected. But what it is picking up are keywords, things that are being used at that point in time in the conversation, things that might be useful as prompts to figure out what this person might be talking about so you can maintain context. And so the care provider says, oh, you used to be a teacher. The person living with dementia says, yes, now I'm just trying to think what it was I used to teach. Oh, isn't it terrible? My memory's fading. I was a teacher for something. They used a machine, So this person is, and with the full prosody information, you would hear it a lot clearer, having trouble locating a concept that they're trying to express. The concept is something that they used to teach. So having a conversation like this person used to be a teacher, they used to teach something, but they can't quite put their finger on what it was that they used to teach. And so the keywords we've detected are teaching, teach, teacher, used, machine. Right? So at this point here, we haven't quite detected trouble, but we have got some keywords. So we're building up some context about what this person might have taught. The care provider offers a back channel. Stubby shorts and that, all that sort of thing. Now, this is a context, this is an Australian thing. Stubby shorts are very, very short kind of shorts that they're stubby, right? They're very short. Were worn by a lot of rugged Australian men back in the day, and still worn by footballers today. But yeah, this is a critical piece of information. Stubby shorts being given up by this person living with dementia. Now, at this point, our trouble detection system has detected, yes, they're still having trouble. They can't quite locate what it was that they were doing. So perhaps we need to step in and offer some kind of assistance for this word finding difficulty. And so what happens is these keywords are fed into our language bank. So we're building this language bank, which is with that person with dementia, is fed with information about their life, their history, loved ones, kinship, all the kind of information that might be pertinent to helping the system work. And if that information, those keywords are fed into that, it will search across here and perhaps give this piece of information to a device which this care provider can see. And it would say this taught sewing at a particular technical college. This person taught sewing. That's what they did, right? And that's a pertinent piece of information for the context. Now, the point being, the care provider could see that and choose to use that information or choose to just continue the conversation as it is. It's on them as a trained professional to use this information as they see fit. But at that point, if they don't know that background context, they haven't had that conversation before, it can provide it, and that person has said, oh, a sewing teacher, right? Used to be a sewing teacher. And the person living with dementia says, yes, a sewing teacher, that's what I was, right? So successfully resolves this particular instance of trouble. So that's the kind of grand vision for Florence as it sits. There's a lot of issues to resolve here. Questions of ethics around the ways in which we collect this data, who has access to it, the ways in which, other issues that these people have, such as their daily life, their lived experience, and there's a lot of big questions there. Thankfully, we've got a highly interdisciplinary team to look at this. We've got legal experts, we've got those who are occupational therapists, speech pathologists, the whole work to try and get at this issue. But the point here, and what I want to leave you with, is the idea in my mind of post-humanism and the importance of designing these technologies is all of those technologies I've shown you, every single one of them has been done in collaboration with people in communication. So I'll resolve this idea. What's a computational social scientist, right? So I'm a computer scientist originally, but I kind of made the move into journalism and communication later in my career. But I make a point of always making sure I work with those who are domain experts in these particular areas. As a technologist, I don't like just jumping into a field and saying, hey, look, I have a technology, go, right? That kind of disruption, it doesn't take account of the nuanced perspectives of those working in the field, right? The ways in which they operate, the ways in which they do their work, their own research. And I always put out an impassioned plea to my colleagues in technology and computer science. It's fine to work, and there's amazing things we can do with technology. We have to work with people in these fields, not against them, by developing technologies that would perhaps supplant or ignore very, very interesting and important perspectives that exist in those fields, and particularly of ours in communication here. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan.